Welcome to Caledonia Sleeps, your peaceful escape into the heart of Scotland. If these stories bring you comfort, a like and a subscribe means the world, and it helps more people find their way to the fireside. Drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're listening from tonight. And as you do, begin to settle in. Pull the covers a little closer. Let the room grow still around you. Outside it is May in the Scottish borders. The hedgerows are thick with new growth. White hawthorn blossom ghosting the lanes. The evening's long and soft and green. The fire is burning low in the hearth, the peat glowing amber and red at its heart, and somewhere far above the darkening sky, the first stars are beginning to show. Tonight, we are going further than we have gone before. We have wandered the glens together. We have stood at the edge of the lochs in the early morning, watched mist rise of dark water. We have walked through old kirkyards and forest paths, and the high passes of the Highlands. But tonight, I want to take you out to sea, past the last harbour lights, past the outer islands, past the point where other boats turn back, out in the open Atlantic, where the waves run long and grey, and the wind carries nothing from the land, because there is no land behind you now, only water and sky, and somewhere ahead, in the silver distance, the faint outline of cliffs rising from the ocean like the walls of another world. That is where we are going tonight, to the islands the Gaels called Hirta, to the place the rest of the world came to know as St Kilda. There is no St Kilda. No saint by that name exists in any calendar, any church record, any list of the blessed. The name appears for the first time in 1592, printed on a Dutch navigational chart called the Tresor der Zeevaart, the treasure of navigation, by a cartographer who may never have set eyes on these islands himself, where he found the name or what it meant to him. Nobody knows. The Gaelic name Hirta is older and stranger still, its meaning uncertain and debated, possibly rooted in an old word for death or danger, possibly Norse, possibly something older still that no language now living can quite reach. What we know is this: people have lived here for at least 4,000 years, perhaps longer, long enough that their bones and their tools and the ash of their fires lie layered in the earth beneath the grass, one life pressed upon another, generation after generation, choosing to stay in one of the most remote and difficult places on the surface of the earth, and not merely staying, singing, marrying, building, climbing, fishing, laughing around fires, not so different from this one. Tonight, I want to tell you their story. St Kilda is not one island, but 4. Hirta is the largest, the one where the village stood and the people lived. Soy, Borare and Doon cluster around it, used for grazing animals, for bird harvesting, for the extraordinary and terrifying work of the sea stacks. The cliffs of Connacher on Hirta are the highest sea cliffs in the United Kingdom, dropping more than 430 metres straight into the Atlantic. Stand at the edge on a clear day, and the sea below looks like a painting of the sea, too far down to be entirely real. The islands sit 40 miles west-northwest of North Uist in the Outer Hebrides, and that distance matters. 40 miles does not sound like much on a map, but on the open Atlantic in a small boat, in the kind of weather that this ocean produces without warning or apology, 40 miles is the distance between a world and another world entirely. In winter, the seas around St Kilda made landing all but impossible for months at a time. The island simply closed. The people who lived there were sealed in with their stores of salted birds and preserved eggs and dried grass and whatever they had managed to set aside before the last autumn boat departed, and they waited together for spring. The first boat of the year, arriving in late April or May, was not merely a supply run. It was the reopening of the world. It brought news of deaths and marriages and wars and harvests on the mainland, of things that happened while the islands slept behind their wall of winter water. It brought goods the islanders could not produce themselves, and it brought visitors, sometimes curious travellers who had heard tales of this extraordinary community living at the very edge of the known world, and who wanted to see it for themselves. One such visitor arrived in May of 1697. His name was Martin, a scholar and writer from Skye, and a Gaelic speaker himself. He came by open longboat across 40 miles of open sea, a voyage that took several days. And when he arrived and sat among the people of Hirta, and watched how they lived and listened and how they spoke, he wrote something that has stayed with me since I first read it. The people of St Kilda, he said, seem to be almost the only people in the world who feel the sweetness of true liberty. Let us find out why. Every morning on Hirta, after prayers, the men of the island gathered in the street, not in a hall or a church or a chief's house, in the street, in the open air, in the wind of the Atlantic, with the cliffs above them and the bay below, and the sky doing whatever the sky does on a North Atlantic island, in whatever season it happened to be. They stood together, or sat on the stone walls, or leaned in the doorways of their cottages, and they talked. This was the St Kilda Parliament, and it was one of the most remarkable forms of community governance that Scotland has ever produced. There was no leader, no chairman, no rules of order, no agenda, no minutes taken. Every adult man had the right to speak, and every voice carried the same weight. They talked about the work that needed doing that day, which cliff face needed attention, which flock needed moving, which family needed extra provisions, what the weather was likely to do, whether the boats could safely put out. Decisions were reached by consensus, not by majority, by agreement. Robert Connell, a journalist who visited the island in 1887, watched the Parliament in action and wrote about it afterwards. He noticed something that struck him as extraordinary for his era, that when one islander received a gift of tobacco, he shared it, leaf by leaf, with every smoker on the island, not because anyone told him to, not because it was a rule, simply because that was how things were done. What was held by one was held by all. No serious crime was ever recorded in 4 centuries of St Kilda's documented history. No feuds bitter enough to permanently divide the community. No murder, no theft or any consequence. On an island with never more than 180 souls, where every face was known and every action witnessed, perhaps that is not so surprising, but it also reflects something deeper, a community that had arranged itself over generations around the principle that survival required genuine cooperation, and that genuine cooperation required genuine equality. It has been said that the spirit of the St Kilda Parliament, that daily gathering of equals in the open street, was one of the ideas that moved through the mind of the architect Enric Morales when he commissioned to design the new Scottish Parliament building in Edinburgh. The new Parliament, opened in 2004, was conceived as a place where people sit among each other rather than above each other, a parliament built, in some sense, to the spirit of a street in Hirta, where no man was greater than his neighbour. The women of the island had their own world running alongside the men's, the weaving, the spinning, the preparation of the birds, the plucking and cleaning and salting, the making of cheese from the milk of the small island cattle, the songs that accompanied all of this work, songs for spinning, songs for walking the cloth, lullabies sung in a Gaelic that had been spoken on Hirta for more centuries than anyone could count, in a dialect so particular to the island that mainland Gaelic speakers sometimes struggled to follow it. While the men held their parliament in the street each morning, the women held their own steady parliament of daily work and daily song, and the island ran on both. You have to understand the birds to understand St Kilda. You have to let them fill your imagination the way they filled the sky above that island, in their millions, in their noise and their smell and their sheer staggering abundance, before anything else about this place makes sense. Today, St Kilda is home to the largest colony of northern gannets in the world, 30,000 breeding pairs on Boraree and the sea stacks alone, 24% of the entire global gannet population, nesting on these rocks at the far edge of Scotland. There are 136,000 pairs of Atlantic puffins, 67,000 pairs of northern fulmars. The air above the islands is never quiet. It is never empty. Even now, in a world where seabird numbers have declined almost everywhere else, St Kilda fills the sky. For the people who lived there, this was not wildlife. It was a larder, a workshop, a way of life so complete and so particular that it shaped the bodies, the language, the customs, and the very bones of the community over 4,000 years. The gannet was the great provider. Each year, the St Kildans harvest around 20,000 of them, caught on the sea stacks, killed, and wind-dried without salt in the stone cletchen that dot the hillside of Hirta like a scatter of ancient cairns. A clate is a stone storage hut, built to a design unique to these islands. Dry stone walls with deliberate gaps to let the Atlantic wind pass through, keeping the contents cool and dry. There are 1,260 cletchens on Hirta alone, and a further 170 on the other islands. They are still standing. They still work. Every part of the gannet was used. The bones became needles and pins. The beaks became brooches. The skins became shoes. Martin recorded this in 1697, and his description of the gannet neck shoe has stayed with me ever since. The neck was cut just above the eyes, he wrote, the crown of the head serving as the heel, the whole skin pulled up around the foot like a narrow stocking. A pair of gannet shoes lasted approximately 5 days. The smell, I imagine, was something remarkable. The fulmar was almost equally important. Fulmar oil, rendered from the fat of the birds, burned in the island's lamps. It was used medicinally, rubbed into joints stiff with cold and labour. It was used to preserve rope, to dress the umbilical cords of newborns, to waterproof cloth. The smell of fulmar oil permeated everything on the island and everyone on it. Visitors who came to St Kilda in the 19th century described the smell as one of the first things they noticed, even before they had set foot on shore. A particular, penetrating reek of the sea and the rendered fat of seabirds that clung to the skin and the hair and the clothes of the islanders and announced them in the wider world as immediately and unmistakably St Kildan. The puffin was caught with a fowling rod, a long flexible pole with a horsehair noose at the end. A flick of the wrist could flip the noose over a puffin's head in a single movement. A skilled fowler could catch several hundred in a day. The island dogs, a cross of terrier and spaniel, were trained to retrieve puffins, and a good dog would deliver its catch only to a member of its own family, knowing the difference. These dogs were valued members of the household. as essential to the community's survival as any tool or any boat. But it was the climbing that made St Kilda truly extraordinary. To reach the gannets on Stack and Arman and Stack Lee, sea stacks rising over 500 feet from the ocean, sheer and white, with guano separated from Boraré by channels of raging sea. The men of Hirta had to row out in open wooden boats, land on near vertical rock faces in whatever the Atlantic was doing that day, and climb, barefoot, on ropes of plaited horsehair, encased in salted cowhide, looped around their torsos. Some of these ropes had been made by their grandfathers, some were older still, passed down through generations as valued possessions, worn smooth by the hands of men who were long dead. Boys first went to the cliffs at 10 years old, accompanying their fathers to watch and learn. By 12 or 14, they were climbing themselves. By the time a St Kilda man was fully grown, his feet were different from any feet on the Scottish mainland. The ankles thickened, the toes spread and strengthened. The whole structure of the foot, shaped by childhood years of gripping bare rock, over a drop of hundreds of feet to the sea below. The men worked in groups of 4 or 5 on the stacks, some climbing while others waited in the boats below to receive the birds thrown down there from above. On the high sections of cliff where boats could not reach, birds were heaped in crevices and piled around the fowler's body, heads tucked through his belt, until he gathered enough to make the descent worthwhile. Adult birds were caught at night, in darkness, when they were less alert. The fowlers lay flat on their backs on the rock face, with their chests exposed, because the birds would land on a warm surface in the dark, and the moment one landed, the man's hands were ready. The fowling was dangerous. Men fell, men drowned. The sea was always there below, cold and deep and indifferent. And yet the knowledge of how to do this, how to read the rock, how to place the rope, how to move on a vertical surface with the ocean 100 feet beneath you, was so thoroughly woven into the identity of every St Kildan man that to be without it was simply not to be of this place. Beneath the village, in the earth below the burial ground, the islanders knew of an ancient stone structure they called Tai an Shia, the house of the fairies. It was an Iron Age souterrain, a long underground passage of dry stone construction, discovered in 1844 and excavated by John Sands in 1877. Inside, when the archaeologist opened it, they found bones, gannet, sheep, cattle, limpet, and stone tools still recognisable to the St Kildans who watched the excavation, because tools of the same design were still in daily use on the island. The same birds, the same stone, the same hands, nearly 2,000 years apart. On the cliff face of Ruival, northwest of the village, there is a door. Not a door made by hands exactly, though it is so perfectly door-shaped, so precisely proportioned, that it seems almost impossible to believe it is entirely natural. It is an opening in the rock face, a gap in the cliff over a gully, with what appears to be a lintel across the top, and a drop of somewhere between 120 and 180 feet to the sea below. The St Kildans called it the mistress stone, or sometimes the lover's stone, and every young man who wished to prove himself worthy of a wife was required by ancient custom to go there. Martin described the ritual in 1697 in a passage that is both matter-of-fact and quietly terrifying. The young man climbed to the mistress stone. He stood on the lintel, on the very edge of the opening, on his left foot only, with half of his soul extended over empty air. Then, balancing on that single foot, with nothing but 300 feet of Atlantic cliff beneath him, he drew his right foot across and out to the left, bowing forward as he did so, and extended both fists out over the drop. That was it. That was the test. If he could do it, if he could hold that position, balanced on the lip of the world, with the sea screaming below and the wind doing whatever it chose, then he had acquired, as Martin wrote, no small reputation. He was considered worthy of the finest mistress in the world. The community around him understood what it meant. He had proved that his nerve was equal to the cliffs, that when the rope was running and the rock was wet and the gannet colony was 300 feet above the boat, he would not fail. Martin himself was invited to attempt the mistress stone during his visit. He declined, noting with characteristic dry wit that this performance would have quite contrary effect upon me, by robbing me both of my life and mistress at the same moment. There is something deeply serious underneath the ritual, of course. A community whose survival depended entirely on men who could climb vertical rock faces above the open Atlantic could not afford a man who flinched at height. The mistress stone was not cruelty or showing off. It was a practical test, dressed in the language of romance and courtship. It was the island's way of knowing who its people were. Now I want to tell you something harder. For perhaps 150 years, possibly longer, more than half of the babies born on the island of Hirta died before they were a fortnight old. The community called it the Kratan Nagaul, the stranger's cold, or more commonly, the 8-day sickness. The babies were born apparently healthy. The first week passed without sign of trouble, and then, somewhere between the 6th and the 14th day of life, the child would begin to cry differently. The jaw would stiffen, the body would arch backward in a rigid spasm. Within hours, in most cases, the child was gone. We know now, because of careful analysis of the St Kilda parish registers, that the work of medical researchers in the 20th and 21st centuries, that the cause was neonatal tetanus, an infection that entered through the cut umbilical cord. Before 1892, the mortality rate from this condition on Hirta reached as high as 69 in every 100 live births. In some years, every single baby born on the island died in its second week of life. The community accepted this with a resignation that horrified the outside visitors who witnessed it, not because the St Kildans did not grieve. They grieved, of course they did, every time, as parents have always grieved, but because there was no framework available to them in which this loss was anything other than ordinary. It had always happened. Their parents had lost children this way, their grandparents, their great-grandparents. The registers of the dead were full of children who had lived 7 days, 8 days, 9 days, and no more. And because it had always happened, and because there was no doctor on the island, and no means of investigation available to them, the community could only continue. The practice most widely associated with causing the tetanus infections was the midwifery tradition of anointing the cut umbilical cord with a mixture of fulmar oil, that same oil that lit their lamps and preserved their ropes, and dung. It was a custom of care intended to protect the newborn. The fulmar oil was trusted. It was the island's great preserver, the thing that kept rope from fraying, and skin from cracking, and stored birds from rotting. Of course it was applied to a newborn's most vulnerable wound. The logic was sound. The outcome was catastrophic. It was the islanders' minister, the Reverend Angus Vidus, who eventually understood what was happening and convinced the islanders to stop. He had no medical training. He had only the observation that the practice correlated with the deaths, and the authority of his position, and the persistent, gentle persuasion of a man who had watched too many small graves opened on the hillside. The islanders trusted him. They stopped the practice. After 1892, not a single child on St Kilda died of the 8-day sickness. The registers record this clearly. 1 year there are deaths, the next year there are none. 150 years of loss ended in a single generation by a man with no more than conviction and care and the willingness to say, something we have always done is the thing that is killing our children. Sit with that for a moment, the weight of what those families carried for generation after generation without understanding why. The graves on the hillside above the village, the tiny dates carved in stone, so close together, the same families, the same names, over and over, and then the silence. The first year without a grave of that kind, the first child who lived past a fortnight, the particular quality of that relief after so long. There is a clate in the village meadow of Hirta that looks to the untrained eye like all the other cletchen scattered across the hillside, a rounded dome of dry stone, grass growing over the top, ancient and still. But this one is known by a different name. It is called Lady Grange's house, and the story attached to it is one of the most extraordinary and disturbing in all of Scottish history. Rachel Chesley was born in Edinburgh in 1679, the daughter of a man who was eventually executed for shooting the Lord President of the Court of Session in the street. She grew up to be, by all accounts, a woman of strong opinions and considered temper, and in 1707 she married James Erskine of Grange, a Scottish judge, a prominent man, a man with powerful friends, and as it turned out, a secret he could not afford to have exposed. James Erskine was a Jacobite, not openly, never openly, for a judge with Jacobite sympathies in Hanoverian Scotland was a man walking a very narrow path indeed, but secretly, in correspondence and in the quiet rooms of Edinburgh's legal establishment, he supported the Stuart cause, and his wife knew. Their marriage deteriorated badly. By 1730, they had separated, and Rachel was making threats. She would tell what she knew. She would expose him. Perhaps she did not fully understand what she was threatening, or perhaps she understood perfectly well and simply did not care. Either way, James Erskine acted before she could. In January 1732, in the dark of night, men came to Rachel's lodgings in Edinburgh. She was seized, wrapped in a cloak, and carried out into the street. What followed was a journey of extraordinary cruelty, passed from one set of hands to another, moved at night through the Highlands, taken to the Hebrides, held on one island and then another, always further from Edinburgh, always deeper into a world where no one spoke her language and no one knew her name. Her husband declared her dead. He held a mock funeral. He placed a notice in the Edinburgh newspapers. Rachel Chesley arrived on Hirta in approximately 1734. She was held there for roughly 6 years. She spoke no Gaelic. The islanders spoke nothing else. The minister came and went. The factor's boat came once a year. Beyond that, there was nothing. No connection to the world she had known. No means of communication. No hope of rescue that she could see. She was housed, fed, given a woman to wait on her, and utterly, completely imprisoned by geography. But Rachel Chesley was her father's daughter. She did not give up. She managed somehow to get letters off the island. One of them, it is said, was hidden inside a ball of yarn, carried unknowingly by a sympathetic islander to the mainland. These letters were extraordinary documents, written in a hand made trembling by cold and fear and years of isolation, addressed to anyone who might listen, describing what had been done to her. In one of them she wrote, "I am the unfortunate wife of Mr. James Erskine of Grange. After I had lived 25 years in great love and peace, he all of a sudden took a dislike to my person." Her letters caused a sensation in Edinburgh When they finally reached their intended readers, efforts were made to rescue her. Her cause was taken up by sympathetic friends, but James Erskine's powerful allies blocked every attempt to send a boat to Hirta. Every legal avenue was closed. The wife he had declared dead remained alive on the most remote island in the British Isles, and nothing could be done. Rachel was eventually removed from St Kilda around 1740, taken to Assynt in Sutherland and later to Skye. She died at Idrigal on Skye in 1745, after more than a decade of captivity. She was approximately 65 years old. James Boswell and Samuel Johnson, on their famous tour of the Hebrides in 1773, discussed her case with each other, sitting in exactly the kind of island parlour she would never sit in again. Johnson's response was characteristic, darkly amused, and not entirely kind. If MacDonald would let it be known that he had such a place for naughty ladies, he remarked, he might make it a very profitable island. The portraits of both Rachel and her husband hang in the Scottish National Portrait Gallery in Edinburgh. When the writer Margaret Macaulay sought them out, she discovered that they had been placed together in the same cold store. The clate in the village meadow is still there. The grass grows over it. The dry stone walls are still sound. In the summer, when the seabirds wheel above the village and the volunteers work to maintain the clachan, someone will point it out to visitors, and the story will be told again. The most remote prison in Britain, the woman who would not stop writing letters, the yarn with a message hidden inside, thrown onto a boat, carried across 40 miles of Atlantic to a world that could not quite reach her in time. There is something in the image of the St Kilda mailboat that I find almost unbearably moving. Not the ingenuity of it, though the ingenuity is real. Something older than that. Something about the act itself. The act of putting words into a small vessel and committing them to an ocean that might carry them anywhere or nowhere, with no certainty of arrival, no way of knowing if the message would ever be found. The mailboat was a simple thing, a piece of wood carved into the rough shape of a boat, hollowed out and fitted with a small lid. Inside the hollow, the letter was placed, folded carefully, perhaps with a few coins to persuade whoever found it to act on its contents. The wooden boat was then tied to a float, an inflated sheep's bladder, buoyant enough to keep the whole contraption riding the surface of the Atlantic, and it was cast into the sea. The tradition was developed in the 1870s by a journalist named John Sands, who found himself stranded on the island during one of the periods when the winter seas made departure impossible. He had understood something about the Atlantic currents around St Kilda, that they ran reliably in a direction that would carry a floating object toward the Scottish mainland or the Northern Islands. A small enough vessel, riding high enough in the water with enough buoyancy, would travel, and so he built one and threw it in. In 1877, his mailboat reached Bursey in Orkney in 9 days. A rescue vessel was sent. The system worked. In September 1885, the island faced a crisis. A severe storm had destroyed much of the food stores. Winter was coming. The regular boat would not arrive for months. The islanders were in genuine danger of starvation. A 14-year-old schoolboy named Alexander Gillies Ferguson, who had heard about Sans mailboats, built 5 of them, placed urgent messages inside each one describing their situation, and threw them all into the sea. One reached the Gallon Head in Lewis within days. The news spread quickly. £110 was raised on the mainland. Provisions were bought. A boat was chartered, and the islanders survived the winter. Mailboats from St Kilda have been found as far as Norway, Iceland, and Denmark. One is in the collection of the Royal Museums, Greenwich. Another is in the West Highland Museum at Fort William. The National Trust for Scotland, which now cares for the islands, sent a mailboat in 2020, and it was found on a beach in Orkney. The current still runs the same way. Think about what it would feel like to be the person who found one of those small wooden vessels washed up on a beach at the edge of the world. To open the lid and find the letter inside, carefully folded, written in a hand made careful by the knowledge that this might be the only way, the only possible way to reach someone. The faith that the sea might carry your words where your body could not go. The faith, against all evidence and all logic, that the message would arrive. In July of 1840, on the sea stack of Stack and Armagh, 3 St Kildan fowlers caught a bird they had never seen before. It was large, larger than a gannet, almost penguin-like in its bearing, with a black back and a white front, and a large white spot beside each eye. It could not fly. When they approached it, it stood its ground rather than fleeing, watching them with a calm that seemed in retrospect almost tragic. They captured it, tied its legs, and brought it back to the bothy on Borarray. They kept it alive for 3 days. They studied it, and then a storm came. The storm was severe and sudden, as storms on St Kilda always were, and the men in the bothy, watching the wind tear at the sea and the sky and everything between them, reached a conclusion that was entirely reasonable within the logic of their world. The strange bird had brought the storm. It was a witch. It had raised the tempest by some dark art, and the only way to end the storm was to end the bird. They bet it to death with sticks. The bird was the great auk, the last individual ever recorded in Britain. The last known specimens in the world were killed in Iceland a few years later. The species was gone. The St Kildans did not know what they held. Nobody had told them. The naturalists and collectors who were already elsewhere in the world, beginning to understand that the great auk was vanishing, they were not here, on this stack, in this storm. The men who killed it were not cruel or careless. They were doing what made sense to them, in a storm that frightened them, with a strange creature whose presence they could not explain. They were applying the only framework they had. The story of the great auk is the story of what happens when a world has been sealed from outside knowledge for centuries, suddenly finds itself in contact with a larger world that has moved on. The St Kildans were about to discover this in ways that went far beyond a single bird. By the middle of the 19th century, steamships had cut the journey time to St Kilda from several days by open boat to less than a single day. Victorian tourists began to arrive in numbers. They brought money, which changed the economy. They brought diseases against which the islanders, sealed for so long, generation after generation, in their remote immunity, had almost no protection. They brought new ideas about what life could look like, and those ideas lodged in their minds of the young men who looked at the visitors' clothes and their cameras and their evident ease, and began for the first time to want to leave. And the missionaries had already arrived. In 1822, the Reverend John MacDonald, known across the north of Scotland as the Apostle of the North, landed on Hirta. He was a man of burning conviction and extraordinary energy, and he preached 13 sermons in his first 11 days on the island. The St Kildans, who had lived in a kind of easy, informal relationship with Christianity for generations, Catholic roots, Protestant overlay, the old ways still present underneath it all, took to him with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including MacDonald himself. They wept when he finally left. His successors were less gentle. The transformation of St Kilda's spiritual life from the relaxed singing, dancing community that Martin had described in 1697 into one of the most intensely Calvinist congregations in Scotland happened over the course of a few decades. Sabbath observances became absolute. Work ceased entirely on Sundays. Religious gatherings consumed time that had previously gone to essential seasonal labour. The islanders who had always lived their faith in a rhythm fitted to the rhythms of the birds and the sea and the cliffs found themselves trying to fit their lives into a calendar that came from somewhere else entirely. Whether outside contact ultimately helped the community of St Kilda or hastened its end is a question that has been argued ever since. The tetanus deaths stopped because of outside knowledge. The food crises of the 19th century were answered by mainland charity. But the islanders who emigrated to Australia in 1852 suffered devastating mortality on the voyage, their immune systems unprepared for the diseases of the wider world. and the young men who left after the First World War, drawn to the wages and the possibilities of the mainland, never came back. By the spring of 1930, the end was already written. 13 men, 10 women, 8 girls, 5 boys, 6 widows. That was what remained of 4,000 years of continuous habitation on Hirta. 36 people spread across 10 households, with 6 of the 16 cottages standing empty on the main street. The oldest residents could remember when there had been 100 people there. The youngest had grown up, knowing they were the last. The young men had been leaving for years, drawn to the mainland by wages and by futures that the island could no longer offer. A severe influenza outbreak in 1926 had killed 4 of the remaining men. The soil had been slowly poisoning itself for generations. The peat ash and seabird carcasses, used as fertilizer, had gradually contaminated the fields, and the harvests had been failing in the late 1920s with a persistence that frightened everyone. Then, in January 1930, a young woman named Mary Gillies fell ill while pregnant and had to be taken to hospital on the mainland. She died in Glasgow in May, and her baby with her. In July, another Mary Gillies, 22 years old, died on the island itself of tuberculosis. 2 young women, within months of each other, their death the consequence of a community too small and too isolated to provide the care that might have saved them. It was the island's nurse, Williamina Barclay, who helped organise what came next. On the 10th of May 1930, 20 of the remaining islanders signed a petition to the government. They did not demand it. They asked, "We do not ask to be settled together as a separate community," they wrote. "But in the meantime, we would collectively be very grateful for assistance and transference elsewhere, where there would be a better opportunity of securing our livelihood." The evacuation was set for the 29th of August. The morning arrived with the particular heartless beauty that the Atlantic sometimes produces, calm and sparkling, the sky a cloudless blue, the cliffs of Oysheville gold in the early light. The islanders had spent the days before packing whatever they could carry, selling what they could to the summer's visitors, leaving the rest. On the morning itself, they rose before dawn and prepared, for the last time, to leave. Before they locked their doors, each family placed an open Bible and a small pile of oats inside their house, not as a gesture for visitors to find and photograph, as something older than that, a threshold offering, a farewell. The doors were locked, the keys were taken. At 7 in the morning, HMS Harebell came into Village Bay. By 8 o'clock, every islander was aboard. The ship turned and began to move, and the island fell behind. There is an account from one of the naval officers present, a Lieutenant Commander Pomfret, who noted that the islanders had remained cheerful throughout, though obviously very tired. But another account, from one of the St Kildans themselves, describes the moment differently, as the long antler of Doon fell back onto the horizon, and the familiar outline of the island grew faint. The severing of an ancient tie became a reality, and the St Kildans gave way to tears. One of them looked back at the island they were leaving and said it looked like an open grave. They were settled in Lochaline and Morven, and in Oban, and in Inverness, and in Stromeferry, and in other places on the Scottish mainland. Forestry work was found for the men. The women learned to cook on iron stoves rather than open fires. The children started in mainland schools, speaking a Gaelic that their classmates did not entirely recognise. The last two native-born islanders to survive lived into the 21st century. Norman John Gillies, who was 5 years old on the morning of the evacuation, died in Cambridge in 2013 at the age of 88. He had joined the RAF during the Second World War and spent his adult life on the mainland. Rachel Johnson, who was 8 years old when she left Hirta, died in a care home in Clydebank in April 2016 at the age of 93. Those who knew her in her last years said that any mention of St Kilda, any mention at all, would cause a gentle smile to cross her face. St Kilda is still there. The cliffs still rise from the Atlantic. The gannets still wheel above Borarray in their thousands. The puffins still nest in the soft turf of the hillsides, and the fulmars still patrol the cliff faces. And the St Kilda wren, a subspecies found nowhere else on earth, slightly larger than its mainland cousins, adapted to this particular wind and this particular rock, still sings from the stone walls of the village in summer. The village itself is maintained by the National Trust for Scotland with the help of summer volunteers who come to repair the collection and preserve the cottages. The church still stands, the school still stands, the manse still stands. Walk down the main street on a summer's day and you can see exactly how it was. The row of single-storey cottages facing each other across the grass, the allotments behind, the great arc of Village Bay below, the cliffs rising on either side. Everything is in its place. The only thing missing is the people. Beneath the burial ground, the tie on Shia still sits in the earth, the house of the fairies, older than the village by 2,000 years, older than Christianity, older than any name we have for it. In the village meadow, the rounded dome of Lady Grange's clate still stands in the grass, unchanged. On the cliff face of Ruival, The mistress stone still waits, door-shaped and precise, its lintel still overhanging the same drop of 180 feet to the same sea. In 1986, St Kilda was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of only a handful of places in the entire world to hold dual status, recognised simultaneously for both its natural and its cultural significance, for the seabirds and for the people who lived alongside them, and for the extraordinary, specific, irreplaceable thing that combination produced over 4,000 years. What that thing was is hard to put entirely into words. A community that arranged itself around genuine equality, that held its parliament in the street because the street belonged to everyone. A community that sang while it worked and worked while it sang, whose language was threaded through with words for birds and cliffs and the particular qualities of different kinds of wind. A community that faced loss, generation after generation, with a resilience that the outside world sometimes misread as indifference, and that was, in truth, the only response available to people who had to keep going regardless. A community that built 1,000 stone huts for keeping birds and left a Bible in each of their houses on the morning they left for the last time, and looked back at the island growing smaller on the horizon and wept. The mailboats are still being launched. The currents still carry them. The tradition of placing a letter in a small wooden vessel and trusting the sea to deliver it has outlasted the community that invented it by nearly a century now, launched each year by the volunteers and researchers who spend their summers on the island, carried by the same Atlantic currents toward the same Scottish shores. There's something deeply comforting in that, in the idea that the message can still travel, that the current still runs, that the open Bible and the small pile of oats are still, in some way, there on the threshold, an offering placed by people who understood, as few of us ever do, exactly what it cost to stay and exactly what it cost to go. The seabirds fill the sky above Hirta tonight, as they have filled it for longer than anyone can remember. The Cletchen hold nothing now but air and stone and the smell of 4,000 years. The cliffs are the same cliffs they always were, indifferent, enormous, beautiful beyond any word we have for beautiful. Sleep now, and let the island rest with you. Let the Atlantic hold you as it held them, not gently, never gently, but completely. Let the seabirds carry you down into the dark. If these stories have brought you comfort tonight, if they have given you something to carry with you into sleep, then a like and a subscribe means more than I can say. It helps more people find their way here, to the fireside, to the stories. Good night from the fireside. Good night from Scotland. Good night